May 10, 1945, Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg, British interrogation facility. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the cigarette clenched between Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal's fingers as he leaned forward across the interrogation table. The notes in front of him carried a weight far heavier than paper could ever bear, words that would remain lodged in his memory indefinitely. Excuses are unacceptable. Carelessness cannot be tolerated. If I lacked the drive from my principles and convictions, I would abandon this mission, deeming myself a failure. These lines did not originate from Kuhlenthal himself. They were penned by his most valued operative, Juan Pujol García, better known to the Allies as Arabelle, in a moment of furious frustration after German radio operators had overlooked his critical warning regarding the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. Kuhlenthal had trusted Arabelle implicitly, defending him to Berlin and wagering his own professional credibility on the authenticity of the intelligence received. Now, confronted with the aftermath of war, he realized that the triumph he had once celebrated as a pinnacle of espionage was, in reality, a devastating misjudgment. For 4 years, the former Abwehr officer had managed what he was convinced to be Nazi Germany's most effective espionage network within Britain. 27 operatives reporting detailed observations about Allied troop movements, military preparations, and strategic planning. The Germans, so persuaded by the apparent sophistication of Kuhlenthal's network, refrained entirely from recruiting additional spies on British soil. What neither Kuhlenthal nor any German intelligence official suspected was that none of these agents actually existed. Every single one was a fabrication, the invention of a single man residing in a modest North London home, acting entirely under the direction of British intelligence.
The scale of this deception was astonishing. Between January 1944 and the D-Day landings, over 500 radio messages were transmitted, sometimes exceeding 20 messages per day. Pujol also generated 315 letters, each averaging around 2,000 words. More than 60 of his reports were officially incorporated into the OKW intelligence briefings. The operational impact was enormous. 2 armored divisions and 19 infantry divisions were held in reserve at Pas de Calais, prepared for a second Allied assault well into July and August 1944, diverted entirely from Normandy. Yet the German intelligence collapse had roots that reached back years. By 1941, the Abwehr faced a structural and operational crisis that was impossible to acknowledge even internally. Between September and November 1940, fewer than 25 agents had been successfully sent to Britain, most originating from Eastern Europe, inadequately trained and often poorly motivated. Every operative dispatched had been captured, coerced into double agent work, or executed. The vaunted German intelligence apparatus had become virtually blind. In Madrid, the Abwehr's station maintained an outwardly diplomatic presence in a stately building on Caliph Fernando el Santo, while behind the facade, station officers struggled to cultivate any credible sources of intelligence from Britain. Wilhelm Leiner, also known as Gustav Lent, the station chief, had been unable to secure a single reliable agent in the British Isles. His deputy, Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, increasingly grew frustrated with the inefficacy of their operations. The situation became more complex when Admiral Wilhelm Canaris took a personal interest in Kuhlenthal, effectively undermining Leiner's authority and placing Kuhlenthal in a unique position within Nazi intelligence circles. Kuhlenthal himself was an unusual figure, a Mischling possessing Jewish ancestry through his grandmother, yet in 1941, Canaris had obtained an Aryan certificate for him, allowing him to navigate the Nazi hierarchy and operate with an authority unusual for someone of his background. His career, fraught with moral ambiguity and operational complexity, would ultimately intersect with the most elaborate deception of the Second World War, an intelligence triumph built entirely on fabricated agents and meticulous illusion. Perhaps the combination of a lifelong sense of marginalization and the constant need to prove his capabilities made him unusually receptive to the prospect of success when it eventually emerged. The pressure coming from Berlin was unrelenting. The German intelligence apparatus needed precise information. The Abwehr demanded data on British military strength, troop movements, morale, and operational readiness. The Luftwaffe required detailed target reconnaissance. The Kriegsmarine sought shipping and convoy schedules. Yet Kuhlenthal, in charge of these operations, had little to offer. Everything shifted in January 1941 when an inconspicuous Spaniard appeared at the German embassy in Madrid. Juan Pujol García was 29 and on paper seemed ill-suited for espionage. His background was ordinary: a failed poultry farmer, a modestly successful hotel manager, and a veteran of the Spanish Civil War who had, in a rare feat, served on both sides without distinction. Despite this, he was driven by a strong personal conviction. Disgusted with both communist and fascist regimes, he felt compelled to contribute in some meaningful way to the Allied cause during the ongoing global conflict. Pujol's initial forays into intelligence work were almost farcical in their ineffectiveness. He approached the British authorities on no fewer than 3 separate occasions, each time offering his services. The British embassy in Madrid, accustomed to a flood of opportunistic Spaniards seeking employment or influence, found nothing remarkable in the earnest yet unassuming man. His professed desire to combat fascism failed to impress them. Unfazed, Pujol devised a more elaborate strategy. If the British refused him, he would first approach Germany, gain their trust, and subsequently present himself to Britain as a double agent. Acting on this plan, he contacted the Abwehr office in Madrid. Initially, the German agents were skeptical and showed little interest in his proposition. Undeterred, Pujol emphasized his diplomatic credentials, claiming he held a visa that allowed him to travel to London as a Spanish diplomat. Over time, his repeated visits, increasingly detailed and intricate accounts, and fervent, if somewhat theatrical, pro-Nazi speeches began to convince Gustav Lisner, the Abwehr recruiter, to take him seriously. Eventually, Lisner referred Pujol to Kuhlenthal. The Major received him with a mixture of doubt and necessity. Spain offered a potential pathway into Britain, and Pujol's claimed diplomatic status made the opportunity intriguing. After several days of instruction in espionage methodology, Kuhlenthal delivered explicit directives. Garcia was not to conduct direct spy work upon arrival in England. Instead, his mission was to establish contacts and recruit additional agents. He was assigned a secure address in Spain for transmitting coded communications, provided with a starting fund of $3,000, given access to the Invisible Ink network, and codenamed Arabelle. His task? Construct a covert intelligence network inside Britain. On July 19, 1941, Juan Pujol departed from Madrid under the pretense of traveling to Britain. German intelligence operative Kuhlenthal, anticipating the arrival of his new contact in London, was keenly awaiting any updates. Contrary to expectations, Pujol never reached British soil. Instead, he made his way to Lisbon, Portugal, where he checked into a modest hotel and embarked on one of the most elaborate intelligence deceptions of the Second World War. In Lisbon, Pujol frequented the city's public library and began compiling a series of entirely fabricated intelligence reports. Drawing on a Spanish translation of the Frommer's Guide to England, a civilian tourist guide, alongside newspapers, magazines, railway timetables, maps, and newsreels, he meticulously constructed a fictional representation of Britain. Sitting in cafes across Lisbon, he studied British guidebooks and archival newspapers, using them as templates to generate plausible but false information. Pujol meticulously invented British weather patterns, transport schedules, military deployments, and everyday cultural details. He crafted a lexicon of life in Britain based on rationing manuals, air raid instructions, blackout regulations, and other period-specific references, ensuring that even minutiae appeared credible to German analysts unfamiliar with the island nation. His initial communications to Kuhlenthal were cautious, reporting mainly on general morale and weather conditions. The German response was positive, signaling interest and giving Pujol confidence to expand his fabrications. To enhance the illusion, Pujol created the persona of a subordinate agent, a Portuguese traveling salesman named Carvalho, supposedly capable of reporting from various regions of Britain. Over time, his reports became increasingly intricate, including details such as convoy movements near Liverpool, troop deployments in Scotland, and production figures for aircraft, all largely invented. He carefully interspersed snippets of authentic information obtained from newspapers that reached Lisbon, giving his accounts an air of authenticity despite the pervasive falsehoods. Despite his careful planning, Pujol occasionally made errors that could have revealed his ruse. He described Glasgow dock workers consuming wine by the liter, a cultural inaccuracy, as beer, measured in pints, was the common drink, and wine consumption was rare among laborers. He also reported impossibly fast train journeys between London and Glasgow, and placed army units in locations that contradicted any accurate map. Nevertheless, Kuhlenthal accepted these reports without suspicion. By the end of 1941, Pujol recognized that his operation had grown too complex to manage alone from Lisbon. To maintain the deception, he fabricated an extensive network of imaginary agents, eventually totaling 27 individuals. These included a Swiss banker in London, a Venetian dock worker stationed in Glasgow, and a German pilot purportedly flying the Britain-Portugal route. Each invented agent had a detailed personal history, a specific area of intelligence access, and a plausible role in the broader network. For instance, the Swiss banker, codenamed J2, was described as an informant on economic and governmental matters, while a Venezuelan student labeled J3 allegedly had access to a Scottish military installation. A Gibraltarian waiter, J4, was said to overhear officers' conversations in local canteens. To justify the appearance of his reports in Lisbon, Pujol fabricated a courier, a fictitious airline employee who supposedly carried the dispatches along the London-Lisbon route, explaining both the postmarks and the delays in delivery. Through this elaborate system, Pujol successfully convinced German intelligence of the veracity of his entirely invented British network. After Operation Torch, the German command demanded faster and more reliable intelligence reporting. In response, Juan Pujol and his collaborator, Tomás Harris, fabricated a completely fictitious radio operator. Simultaneously, British intelligence in London noticed the emergence of an enigmatic German agent. Thanks to Ultra, the highly classified program that decrypted German Enigma messages, they were able to monitor Abwehr communications. German dispatches frequently mentioned an agent named Arabelle, supposedly operating within Britain. The information he sent was consistently inaccurate, yet German intelligence accepted it without question. MI5 grew increasingly concerned. Who was this individual, and how had he avoided detection by Britain's extensive surveillance apparatus? Every dispatch was scrutinized, every detail verified. The conclusion was astonishing. No such agent existed on British soil. By February 1942, MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, became aware of Juan Pujol's efforts, even though he had not yet joined them. The British discovered his work through ultra-intercepts, reading German intelligence reports that, unknown to the Germans, were entirely fabricated. Remarkably, the Germans accepted this false intelligence as authentic. In Lisbon, Pujol faced growing pressure.
His deception was becoming increasingly fragile, and he realized that he could not sustain it without direct support from the Allies. Previous attempts to reach British intelligence had failed. Finally, in February 1942, Pujol approached Lieutenant Patrick Demarest, an American naval attaché stationed in Lisbon. Presenting tangible evidence of his ongoing communications with German intelligence, Pujol's claims were taken seriously. After protracted deliberations among the British intelligence agencies over the proper handling of Pujol, then using the alias Garcia, he was covertly transported from Lisbon to Gibraltar by boat. Once safely in Gibraltar, Pujol was transferred to England, arriving in Plymouth on April 24, 1942. At the docks, two MI5 officers, Cyril Mills and Tomas Harris, were waiting. Harris, fluent in Spanish and well-versed in cultural nuance, was designated as Pujol's handler and would co-design what became one of history's most successful intelligence deceptions. Mills suggested a new code name to match Pujol's extraordinary acting talent, Garbo, after the renowned actress Greta Garbo. The British were astonished by what Pujol had accomplished independently. From Lisbon, armed only with newspapers and guidebooks, he had constructed an entire network of spies that German intelligence fully believed in. With the backing of MI5, the scale and sophistication of the operation could expand dramatically.
The modest two-story house at 35 Crispini Road in Hendon, North London, became the command center for this operation. This unassuming suburban home functioned as both Garbo's residence and the hub for coordinating his fictitious network. Pujol and Harris spent countless hours there, meticulously drafting messages for the Germans. Each dispatch required careful attention to maintain the distinct voice and personality of the imaginary agents. For instance, one fictitious Swiss banker communicated cautiously and formally, while a Venezuelan student reported with naive enthusiasm, and a communist sailor offered bitter critiques of capitalism, yet remained loyal to his supposed employer. Harris eventually shaped a compelling persona for Garbo, blending authentic intelligence, always carefully selected to avoid jeopardizing real operations, with fabricated material. The success of the deception relied on a delicate balance. Too much false information could arouse German suspicion, but too much truth could inadvertently aid the enemy. The network's complexity continued to grow. When Pujol needed to justify the absence of reports from Liverpool, he simply retired the fictional agent stationed there. To support this story, MI5 produced an obituary for the non-existent operative published in the local press. By early 1943, Garbo's network had become so elaborate that visual organizational charts were necessary to track the numerous fictitious agents, each with unique backstories, relationships, and idiosyncrasies. Some agents fell in love, others fell ill, and some demanded higher pay, while others proved unreliable, all entirely invented yet wholly accepted by the Germans. In Madrid, Karl Erich Kunzel, a key Abwehr officer, came to rely almost entirely on the Arabelle reports. The intelligence was so detailed and voluminous that he abandoned efforts to recruit genuine British operatives. When Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German intelligence, visited Spain, Kunzel proudly showcased these reports, highlighting particularly clever or elaborate examples. In March 1943, Garbo even sent a cake to Kunzel with an RAF handbook baked inside, the chocolate icing inscribed with the message, "With good wishes to Odette." The Germans were impressed by the ingenuity. The operation proved financially advantageous as well. By 1943, the Germans were funding all 27 of Garbo's fictional agents, channeling thousands of dollars, carefully monitored by MI5, into British coffers. In effect, the Germans were unknowingly financing their own deception. Kuntenthal, however, was not merely relaying Garbo's intelligence. He often embellished the reports, sometimes introducing errors or meaningless details, including the comical mistake of placing the Isle of Man in Northern Ireland. Through careful planning, theatrical skill, and meticulous attention to detail, Pujol, Garbo, created one of the most extraordinary and effective disinformation campaigns of the Second World War, one that misled German intelligence and saved countless Allied lives. Kolenthal's urgent desire to gain Berlin's favor led him to embellish information far beyond what Garbo had ever provided. In doing so, he constructed an even more intricate web of falsehoods. The dynamic between handler and agent had evolved into something nearly symbiotic. Kolenthal relied on Arabelle not only to preserve his career, but also to protect his reputation. Garbo, acutely aware of this dependency, skillfully manipulated it to her advantage. Pujol observed that the tighter they pressed for control over the communications, the more compliant the German side became. Yet, paradoxically, the more they acquiesced, the more Garbo's reports took on a tone of arrogance and temperamental flair. With each display of her assertiveness, the Germans responded with greater attentiveness and diligence. By January 1944, the situation had escalated to a point where the consequences were existential. German intelligence confided in Pujol that they anticipated a major Allied invasion somewhere in Europe, and they expected him to keep them informed. The carefully constructed intelligence network, which Garbo and Harris had nurtured for over 3 years, was about to confront its most critical test. The Allies' deception strategy, known as Operation Fortitude, was unparalleled in scale and ambition. Its objective was to mislead German command into believing the invasion would strike at Pas de Calais, the narrowest crossing from England to France, rather than at Normandy, the actual target. Even after Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Germans had to remain convinced that it was merely a feint. Central to this ruse was the 1st United States Army Group, initially formed for administrative purposes under General Omar Bradley, but never deployed in action. German intelligence had detected its existence through radio monitoring. The Allies now transformed this formation into a fictitious army of 150,000 men, ostensibly commanded by General George Patton. Garbo's intelligence network entered a period of intense activity. Between January 1944 and D-Day, over 500 radio transmissions were exchanged, averaging 4 messages daily, routed from Garbo through Madrid to Berlin. Each dispatch meticulously added depth to the deception, incorporating fabricated troop movements, training exercises, and logistical preparations, all seemingly pointing toward Pas de Calais. Various agents contributed to this elaborate scheme. The Venezuelan operative, designated Agent 3, reported extensive military preparations in Scotland. Agent 7, a Welsh ex-serviceman, detailed troop concentrations in Dover. Agent 43, an American sergeant, claimed that Patton was stationed in southeast England. Each report reinforced the illusion, while the real 1st United States Army Group, stationed at Pas de Calais, lent the fiction a disturbing veneer of credibility. As the Normandy invasion approached, Garbo and Harris confronted a delicate timing dilemma. To maintain the credibility of their intelligence, Garbo had to transmit warnings to the Germans about the invasion, but the warnings had to arrive too late for the Germans to mount a meaningful defense. On the night of June 5, 1944, special arrangements were made for German radio operators to monitor Garbo, under the pretext that a sub-agent would arrive with critical information. Yet when Garbo initiated contact at 3 a.m., no response came until 8 a.m., hours after Allied paratroopers had already begun landing in Normandy. This delay, a failure on the part of the Germans to respond, became an unexpected masterstroke. When the transmission was finally acknowledged, Garbo conveyed accurate intelligence regarding the invasion, but by that time, it was strategically irrelevant. Frustrated, Garbo expressed her anger at being ignored, insisting that negligence or excuses were unacceptable and that, but for her commitment to her ideals, she would have abandoned the operation entirely. The Germans were left stunned. Their most trusted agent had risked everything to alert them to the impending invasion, yet they had failed to heed her warnings. The meticulous orchestration of deception, reinforced by real troop movements, had successfully misled German command, setting the stage for the Allies' decisive assault on Normandy. After sending repeated apologies to his German handler, Juan Pujol, known by the codename Garbo, was about to deliver the most consequential deception of the Second World War. Just 3 days following the Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy, as British, American, and Canadian troops struggled to secure a foothold under intense German opposition, Garbo dispatched a message of unparalleled significance. This dispatch was lengthy, meticulously detailed, and conveyed a sense of urgent importance, explicitly instructing that it reach the highest echelons of the German command without delay. Crafted in collaboration with his British handlers, particularly Thomas Harris, the report asserted that the Normandy operation was merely a feint. According to Garbo's message, the true Allied assault would be carried out by General Patton's purportedly massive First Army Group, striking at the strategically important location of Pas de Calais. To reinforce the credibility of the report, Garbo's network of agents throughout Britain provided corroborating intelligence, consistently portraying Normandy as a secondary operation, while the bulk of the Allied forces remained staged in southeastern England, poised for the main attack. 2 days later, a German dispatch to their embassy in Madrid praised the intelligence, stating that all information received over the preceding week from Arabelle, the codename for Garbo, had been verified and deemed exceptionally valuable. This communication traveled swiftly up the chain of command, reaching the offices of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel personally read it, Colonel General Alfred Jodl scrutinized it, and Adolf Hitler reviewed it in his Berka headquarters. The impact was immediate. The German 15th Army, stationed at Pas de Calais with over 200,000 troops, was ordered to hold its ground, while the 1st SS Panzer Division advancing toward Normandy was redirected. Similarly, the 116th Panzer Division remained in reserve north of the Seine. The OKW's acceptance of Garbo's intelligence was so complete that entire armored and infantry formations were retained in the Pas de Calais region, anticipating a second invasion that never occurred, persisting throughout July and August 1944. At Wehrmacht headquarters, intelligence from the Arabelle network was treated as authoritative. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, had argued as early as June 8 for redeploying the 15th Army to reinforce Normandy, but Hitler, heavily influenced by Garbo's reports, overruled him. The threat posed by the Phantom Army in southeastern England could not be dismissed, and the strategic paralysis this created left many German units absent from the Normandy battlefield until late July. Throughout the initial weeks of the Allied breakout, German commanders remained misinformed about the true scale of the forces they faced. They were convinced that Britain hosted 89 Allied divisions, more than the actual 47. They assumed Patton commanded a colossal army group, when in reality he had been sidelined, awaiting an active command. They even believed a 4th British Army was stationed in Scotland, threatening Norway, a force that existed solely in Garbo's reports. Even as Allied forces advanced rapidly across France in late July and August 1944, some German officers still expected the real invasion to occur elsewhere.
The effectiveness of Garbo's deception extended far beyond D-Day, creating months of operational hesitation and misallocation of German resources. On July 29, 1944, as the Allies surged through French territory, an extraordinary communication arrived from Germany. Garbo had been awarded the Iron Cross by Adolf Hitler himself for his exceptional contributions to the German war effort. Through his handlers,
Pujol and Harris responded with measured humility, thanking the German leadership while acknowledging the ironic truth that he was wholly undeserving of such a distinction. Garbo's meticulous orchestration of disinformation not only safeguarded the Normandy landings, but fundamentally altered the allocation of German military resources, delaying reinforcements and shaping the course of the Western Front in a manner that underscored the profound strategic value of intelligence and deception in modern warfare. The circumstances were strikingly ironic. Adolf Hitler himself had conferred one of Germany's highest military honors upon a British double agent whose covert efforts had significantly contributed to the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. In a parallel recognition that same year, King George VI secretly appointed Juan Pujol, aka Garbo, as a member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, for the very same contributions. He thus became among the rare few to receive major awards from both sides of the conflict. The presentation of the Iron Cross highlighted the total confidence the Germans had in Garbo. Even as their armies faced setbacks and their defeat became increasingly apparent, they never suspected that the agent they trusted most was in reality orchestrating their downfall. Their faith persisted unwaveringly, despite mounting evidence that should have suggested deception. By September 1944, as Allied forces advanced toward Germany's borders, MI5 confronted a sensitive challenge. After concerns emerged that Pujol might be unmasked as a British operative, the decision was made for him to disappear temporarily. Nevertheless, his network continued transmitting falsified intelligence to German handlers. To preserve the illusion, it was suggested that Garbo was in hiding to evade arrest by British authorities, who were tightening control over his network. Despite the Third Reich teetering on collapse, the ruse persisted. Fabricated reports of non-existent communist infiltrations and fictitious conflicts between American and British units were consistently relayed. German intelligence maintained their trust, never suspecting the reality. Even as Berlin fell and the Wehrmacht surrendered, their files continued to treat Garbo's network as an indispensable source of information from Britain. This brings us to May 1945 in an interrogation room in Luxembourg. Major Karl Erich Quenthal sat across from British intelligence officers who meticulously unfolded the truth about the man codenamed Arabelle. Document after document was presented: Garbo's messages, German replies, orders that held entire divisions in place, and intelligence summaries that reached Hitler himself. The revelation was stark. Every single agent in the network was entirely fictitious. For Quenthal, the discovery was devastating. Over 4 years, he had invested his professional reputation, personal credibility, and career in Arabelle. He had defended him vigorously against skeptics, lobbied for resources to maintain the network, and even boasted directly to senior officials about its effectiveness. From a German perspective, his reports had been taken seriously in Berlin, yet from a British standpoint, his credulity bordered on farcical. The British interrogator then revealed a photograph: an unassuming Spanish man with a modest smile. Juan Pujol García, once a struggling chicken farmer who had walked into the German embassy in Madrid 4 years ago, now stood at the center of an intelligence deception of unparalleled scale. Operating from a suburban house in North London, he had fabricated an entire espionage network so convincingly that German high command had shaped strategic decisions around it. 27 agents, the interrogator confirmed, none of whom had existed, all funded by German resources and all orchestrated by Pujol with the guidance of his British handlers. Quenthal had no response. The reality rendered words meaningless. When fully accounted, the scale of the operation was staggering. More than 500 radio messages had been dispatched by the Garbo network in the critical months leading up to D-Day, and the Germans had expended roughly $340,000 in 1940s currency to maintain an entirely imaginary intelligence apparatus. The elaborate deception successfully diverted over 500,000 German troops from the Normandy coast during the crucial period following D-Day. Later assessments by military historians concluded that Operation Fortitude, with the fictitious agent Garbo at its core, may have accelerated the end of the war in Europe by several months, potentially even a full year. The forces held at Calais, had they been deployed to Normandy, could have transformed the campaign into a catastrophic slaughter. Their absence, however, allowed the Allied armies to secure, fortify, and eventually expand their beachhead with comparatively lower casualties. The strategic impact of the ruse extended beyond battlefield outcomes. The German intelligence apparatus suffered a profound and lasting psychological setback. If a network they had relied on so heavily turned out to be entirely fabricated, what other falsehoods might they have believed? How many other deceptions had slipped past them unnoticed? At the Nuremberg trials, German generals repeatedly referenced the failure of their intelligence as a central factor in their defeat. They had been outwitted, outmaneuvered, and thoroughly misled by an opponent they had gravely underestimated. Field Marshal Keitel, when pressed on the German response, or lack thereof, to the Normandy invasion, could only cite the intelligence that pointed to Calais as the genuine target. For years after the war, the truth behind the deception remained classified. The operational methods of the double-cross system, the strategies of deliberate misdirection, and the identities of the agents involved were all withheld from the public and even from many within the military.
German intelligence officers carried the burden of this misjudgment to their graves, never fully comprehending the scale of their miscalculations. Kuhlenthal himself returned to Germany following his interrogation and lived out the remainder of his life quietly, passing away on October 25, 1975. Whether he ever came to terms with the fact that his greatest wartime accomplishment had been nothing more than a British fabrication is unknown. Those who knew him reported that he continued to believe that Arabelle's network must have had genuine agents, that it could not have been entirely imaginary. Juan Pujol García, the man behind Garbo, disappeared from the public eye after the war. Assisted by MI5, he orchestrated a fake death in 1949, claiming to have succumbed to malaria in Angola. Subsequently, he relocated to Lagunitas, Venezuela, where he spent the next 36 years living quietly, managing a small bookstore and gift shop, with his children completely unaware of the extraordinary life he had once led. It was not until 1984 that historian Robert Allison, writing under the pseudonym Nigel West, finally located Garbo in Venezuela. The discovery sent ripples through the intelligence community. The world learned that the most successful double agent of World War II was alive and running a modest shop in Caracas. That same year, at the age of 72, Juan Pujol García returned to London for the first time since the war. In a private ceremony at Buckingham Palace, the Duke of Edinburgh personally expressed the nation's gratitude. Veterans of D-Day, many learning for the first time about the deception that had spared countless lives, queued to shake his hand. He also visited 35 Crespini Road, a modest house now inhabited by a family entirely unaware that it had served as the center of one of the war's most decisive operations. During his visit, Garcia met surviving MI5 officers who had studied his exploits for decades, uncertain whether he was still alive. Yet perhaps the most striking moment came when he was presented with German intelligence records from the war. Page after page contained detailed reports, evaluations, and commendations entirely built upon his fictitious network. There were payment vouchers for agents who never existed, operational orders issued based on fabricated intelligence, and exhaustive documentation that unwittingly preserved the full architecture of German misjudgment. The record stood as an enduring testament to the extraordinary impact of one man's carefully constructed illusion.
Pujol once asked the intelligence officer who had managed him whether the Germans truly accepted everything he reported. The answer was unambiguous. They believed every detail. Historians of military intelligence often regard the Garbo operation as possibly the most effective single espionage effort of World War II. How could one individual, with guidance from a handler, mislead an entire intelligence system? How did fabricated agents gain more credibility than actual operatives? Part of the explanation lies in the mindset of the German leadership. The Nazi regime, deeply reliant on propaganda and its own self-deception, was particularly prone to accepting information that aligned with its expectations. German commanders assumed Britain harbored spies within its borders, so when Garbo emerged, they were prepared to trust him. They anticipated an Allied attack at Calais, and when Garbo corroborated this, they had little reason to doubt him. Yet the root of Garbo's success extended beyond psychology. It was the meticulous construction of an elaborate illusion. Pujol and his handler, Juan Pujol García and Tomás Harris, did not merely transmit intelligence, they fabricated an entire operational ecosystem. Each supposed agent possessed a unique character, motivations, skills, and vulnerabilities. The network exhibited internal disputes, romantic entanglements, financial pressures, and all the ordinary complexities of human behavior that made it convincing. Former operatives in the Abwehr later acknowledged that producing a steady stream of fabricated reports was safer than sending none at all, as inactivity risked deployment to the front. This environment favored quantity over quality, encouraging German officers to prioritize prolific intelligence over verifiable facts. The human consequences of the deception were profound. Every German division held in anticipation at Calais represented countless Allied soldiers spared from death on the beaches of Normandy. Each additional day of delay allowed the Allies to strengthen their positions, stockpile resources, and prepare for the invasion with greater efficiency. Estimates suggest that Operation Fortitude, the broader campaign in which Garbo was central, likely saved tens of thousands of lives. Soldiers landing on Omaha Beach, struggling through the hedgerows, or breaking out during Operation Cobra owed part of their survival to a Spanish double agent whose existence they would never have known. On the German side, the cost was devastating. Forces that could have repelled the Allies remained idle, and young German soldiers perished on Normandy's sands while reinforcements waited for an attack that never came. Even senior German commanders were affected. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for Atlantic defenses, repeatedly urged the transfer of troops to Normandy after D-Day. Hitler, relying on intelligence from Garbo, known to the Germans as Agent Arabelle, overruled him, leaving Rommel to watch his undermanned forces gradually overwhelmed. Similarly, Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, ultimately faced defeat not through direct combat with Allied armor, but because of strategic illusions conjured by a man posing as a Barcelona chicken farmer. The Garbo story is remarkable in part because it nearly never happened. Pujol had approached British intelligence 3 times before finally gaining acceptance. Had the British been slightly more receptive in 1941 and accepted his offer immediately, the deception might never have evolved into the highly convincing network it became. Pujol's initial isolation, working alone from Lisbon armed only with guidebooks and his imagination, allowed him to develop a level of authenticity that would have been difficult under more conventional supervision. Interestingly, some of Pujol's errors enhanced credibility. Mistakenly reporting ship locations, misunderstanding minor aspects of British culture, these flaws mirrored what the Germans expected from foreign operatives. The network's implausibility became its most convincing feature. Who would suspect that 27 agents were entirely fictional? Who could imagine that the Germans' most productive intelligence network in Britain was managed by a single man living a quiet life in suburban London? The audacity of the deception made skepticism almost impossible. German intelligence simply could not conceive of such an elaborate ruse. When the full scope of Garbo's exploits was revealed decades later, in the 1970s and 1980s, it sent shockwaves through intelligence communities around the world. The double-cross system, with Garbo at its pinnacle, had successfully manipulated every German operative in Britain, demonstrating the extraordinary power of well-crafted deception in warfare. Following the conclusion of the war, German intelligence faced an unsettling truth. Every agent they had dispatched to Britain had either surrendered voluntarily or been apprehended. For surviving officers within the German intelligence apparatus, the revelation was profoundly disorienting. The assumptions underpinning years of wartime espionage, every assessment, every tactical choice informed by supposed agent reports, now appeared not merely flawed, but entirely fabricated. One former Abwehr officer, interviewed decades later in the 1980s, struggled to reconcile with the scope of the deception. He remained convinced that some of the purported agents must have been genuine. Arabelle, he argued, could not have manufactured every detail. The reports had been too meticulous, too convincing. Yet, when confronted with the irrefutable documentation, handwritten messages from Garbo, MI5 files, and detailed pavement logs, he fell into a long silence before murmuring, "Then we were doomed from the start." Even after Germany had formally surrendered, the Garbo network transmitted a final set of messages. These reached Madrid amid the disarray of May 1945 as the Nazi regime crumbled and Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, the German intelligence officer responsible for coordinating with the network, was on the brink of arrest. These last dispatches warned of supposed communist infiltration within Allied forces, secret agreements with the Soviet Union, and emerging post-war tensions, narratives carefully crafted to appear credible yet entirely fictitious. Unlike wartime transmissions, these final messages were never intended for operational use. By then, the Third Reich had ceased to exist, its intelligence infrastructure dismantled, and its personnel subject to interrogation and prosecution. The closing message from the Garbo operation, dated May 5, 1945, just 3 days before Germany's official surrender, reported the arrest of Agent 3, a Venezuelan student who never existed. This fictional capture was sent to a military intelligence service that itself would vanish within days, underscoring the operation's meticulously constructed artifice. Juan Pujol García, the man behind the Garbo persona, passed away on October 10, 1988, in Caracas, Venezuela, at the age of 76. His death received global attention in newspapers. Known as the farmer who outwitted Hitler, the agent credited with safeguarding the success of D-Day, Pujol García had created an entire phantom army. His innovations in crafting believable, multi-layered networks of non-existent agents would become a foundational methodology in modern intelligence work. The operation demonstrated that in espionage, manipulating perceptions could outweigh tangible reality, a principle that shaped intelligence strategies through the Cold War and beyond. Today, a modest exhibit at the D-Day Museum in Portsmouth recounts the story of Agent Garbo. Visitors, many of them descendants of Allied soldiers, encounter for the first time the Spanish double agent whose work directly contributed to the survival of their forebears. Among the artifacts is one of Garbo's encrypted messages, its seemingly ordinary content concealing a vast and deliberate deception that influenced the course of history. Back in Luxembourg in May 1945, a British officer methodically presented the accumulated evidence of the Garbo deception to Kuhlenthal. For nearly an hour, the German intelligence officer absorbed the devastating scale of his failure. Eventually, he asked a single question. The message from June 9th, the one claiming Normandy was merely a diversion, did that originate in London? The interrogator confirmed. The message had been authored by Garbo and his handler over the course of 6 hours, transmitted by radio to Madrid, and then forwarded by Kuhlenthal to Berlin, ultimately reaching Hitler himself. Kuhlenthal nodded slowly, remarking, "Then we lost the war on June 9, 1944. The British officer corrected him gently. "No, you lost the war the moment you accepted Agent Arabelle as real." The final accounting of the Garbo operation reveals its extraordinary scale. 27 entirely fictitious agents were conceived and sustained, each a carefully constructed element of a deception that misled the highest levels of German intelligence and played a decisive role in the Allied victory. Between January and June of 1944, more than 500 radio transmissions were dispatched, each designed to mislead German intelligence about Allied intentions. Over the course of the war, a total of 315 letters were sent, each averaging roughly 2,000 words, filled with fabricated intelligence. In addition, German operatives transferred some $340,000 to support agents who, in reality, did not exist. The reports produced by Agent Garbo were so persuasive that 62 of them were incorporated directly into the intelligence summaries reviewed by the Wehrmacht High Command. As a result of these deceptions, significant German forces were misallocated at critical moments. Entire divisions of the 15th Army were held at Calais following D-Day, while reserves under Panzer's command were kept away from Normandy. This misdirection contributed to a delay of 7 weeks before German leadership recognized Normandy as the principal site of the Allied invasion. The careful orchestration of false information created a kind of strategic standstill, enabling the Allies to establish and consolidate their position in continental Europe. Every invented agent, every fabricated movement of troops, and every simulated conversation played a part in a deception whose impact was profound enough to alter the course of the war. To this day, certain aspects of the Garbo operation remain enigmatic. One puzzling element is how Kuhlenthal, often described by contemporaries as highly intelligent and capable, never detected the ruse. Similarly, German intelligence, famed for its methodical approach, failed to validate a single one of Garbo's purported agents. Part of the explanation lies in structural flaws within the intelligence apparatus itself. For example, one intercepted communication suggested that Kuhlenthal had invested heavily in a so-called agent in London, a Yugoslav diplomat who reportedly cost the Obvier £400 over a span of 2 years. Within Spain, some officers suspected that K was pocketing a portion of these funds, dividing allowances between himself and the diplomat. The system inherently rewarded the production of intelligence rather than its verification. Kuhlenthal's career advancement relied on the existence of Arabelle, leaving him little incentive to scrutinize inconsistencies too closely. Moreover, the German command's urgent demand for intelligence from Britain discouraged skepticism. They relied heavily on their supposedly dependable source and were unwilling to challenge it. The success of the Garbo operation, therefore, stemmed from a convergence of factors: the exceptional imagination of a volunteer double agent. His handler, Thomas Harris, contributed essential guidance, combining strategic oversight with cultural and linguistic insight. The German intelligence apparatus, eager for insights into British operations, proved susceptible to believing carefully constructed reports. Meanwhile, the Allies had access to intercepted communications that enabled them to gauge in near real time whether their deception was having the intended effect. Finally, Operation Fortitude, the overarching strategic ruse aimed at misleading the Nazis about the location of the D-Day invasion, required precisely the type of credible intelligence that Garbo could supply. If any of these elements had been absent, the entire plan might have collapsed. Had Pujol not displayed unwavering persistence, or if Harris had not been available to coordinate the effort, or if German intelligence had not been so eager for actionable information, or if Ultra had failed to provide timely feedback, the intricate web of deception could have unraveled completely. The operation's success rested on a delicate balance. Each component was indispensable.
Decades later, in 1984, during a reunion in London with former MI5 officers, Pujol was asked what drove him to undertake such a perilous mission. His response was strikingly simple, yet deeply reflective. He wanted to contribute positively to humanity. Having witnessed the brutality of the Nazis in Spain, he understood the stakes. While he had no weapons or troops at his disposal, he recognized that his imagination, his ability to invent and relay believable stories, could serve as a powerful instrument against them. In his own words, that was the weapon he wielded. He paused and then added with a quiet smile, "It had proven remarkably effective." The Germans accepted every detail he provided without suspicion. For 4 critical years, German military and intelligence planners relied heavily on the information supplied by Agent Garbo, believing it to be sourced from a vast and loyal network led by a devoted agent in Madrid. Their operational decisions, from troop movements to resource allocation, were influenced by his fabricated reports. Yet the entire structure was an illusion. The so-called intelligence network did not exist, and its perceived leader was a construct of Pujol's imagination. Every warning, every piece of insider knowledge was a reflection of what the Germans wanted to see, not reality. The consequences of this deception were monumental. German confidence in their own intelligence misled them into strategic errors that directly contributed to their defeat. They were undone not by superior forces or firepower, but by the skillful manipulation of perception. Their own certainty became a vulnerability. Their apparent advantage in intelligence was, paradoxically, their most critical failure. When Karl Erich Kuhlenthal left his interrogation in Luxembourg, he carried the sobering realization that his entire professional life had been built upon falsehoods. The network he had praised to Canaris, the agents he had sponsored lavishly, and the reports he had defended so fervently, all were fabrications. Meanwhile, Pujol himself continued quietly in Venezuela, running a modest gift shop, unknown to those around him. His extraordinary impact on the war, crafting the reality that the Germans would believe, remained a secret, his influence invisible yet decisive. The Germans never comprehended the truth until it was too late. By the time the deception was revealed, the Third Reich had already collapsed. Agent Garbo emerged from the shadows of history as perhaps the most effective double agent ever, a man who changed the course of a global conflict not through force, but through imagination, tenacity, and the willingness of his adversaries to accept convenient lies as truth. The D-Day invasion succeeded in part because one individual's creativity could outmaneuver an entire intelligence apparatus. History remembered the armies and weapons, but behind the scenes, it was ingenuity and deception that played the decisive role.